and welcome back. If you've watched my channel for some time, you may remember a video I released late last year where I stripped down, refinished, and spruced up a Ludwig accent kit, and at the end of the video, I ended up bringing it up to a local music venue where I play it quite frequently, and donated it to be the house set there. Now, they already had a house set of drums there, but it was a mismatch of a bunch of different things, and this was going to be a great option for them for the variety of shows they do. The old house kit was primarily made up of a Pearl Rhythm Traveler set, and that included a shallow depth 20 by 8 inch bass drum, along with 3 short stack concert toms, and that really wasn't a very versatile sound. So Taylor, who runs the music there, ended up bringing in his 60s Yamaha toms to leave with the setup and the shallow bass drum, and it worked great for a long time and probably hundreds, if not 1,000 shows. This new setup is serving them really well, and in trade for me donating it to them, Taylor decided to give me the old Pearl Rhythm Traveler toms to take with and do something here. Now, I didn't get to take the bass drum because he loves that little shallow drum, and I don't blame him. But I have the toms here, and I was trying to figure out what to do with them, and eventually I was scrolling on Facebook Marketplace and saw a listing for a Pearl Form 20-inch bass drum, and I made an offer of $30, and the seller accepted, so I drove up to Green Bay, Wisconsin, picked it up, brought it home, and put it on the shelf with those Pearl toms to get to at a later date. This Pearl Rhythm Traveler kit originally had a wrap on it that was like a fire flame finish, which is really not my style, and I stripped that off before I ever gave it to Taylor, and I tried to stain it and make it look good, but it was really some poor work before I had the experience I have now with this channel and working on drums as much as I do. So I think what I'm gonna do is try to strip everything down, cut down this 20-inch bass drum to a shallower depth like the original Rhythm Traveler bass drum, give it some sort of more consistent, clean finish, and hopefully get it out the door to someone else who can use it for years to come. So without any further ado, let's get into it. So much like every other project, it always starts with removing tension rods, rims, heads, and then getting into the shell to remove all the screws for the lugs and mounts. This is typically a pretty long process, but having each of these 3 toms be single-headed cut the time in half, so it actually went by pretty fast. Additionally, since these were already stripped of their original wraps, I didn't need to spend any time doing that. All in all, it took me maybe 5 minutes to get these drums done. The bass drum was due to take a little longer because on top of being a 2-headed drum, there's much more in terms of hardware mounted to the shell. Tom mounts, bass drum spurs, and of course, lugs really add up to be a lot of screws here. On the bright side, this drum did come partially disassembled since it had no front head, just the hoop. I threw all these parts into a large plastic tote, making sure to keep the screws with the spurs and tom bracket together so I wouldn't mix them up with the lug screws, but then I went and grabbed my container of WD-40 to submerge these parts in to remove the light grime and rust built up on them. The hardware on the 3 toms was in good shape and didn't need this treatment, but the bass drum was in pretty rough shape, so I figured a good soaking would help break up the gunk built up on the hardware. While I waited for the WD-40 to do its magic, I removed the wrap on the bass drum shell. Oftentimes I can do this by just using a razor blade to cut the glue holding it together, but this seam was a bit stronger, so I had to pull out my heat gun to loosen up the adhesive. Most of these wraps are held on at just 2 points, so honestly this process goes pretty fast, and the heat makes it very pliable to pick apart. I try to go slow when I'm doing this because I don't want to rip out any wood fibers from the outer ply, but other than that, it's a pretty simple process. Before finishing the prep on this kick drum, I needed to remove the air vent grommet, and for this, I used a countersink bit to break the flange on the inside, and then pulled out the grommet with a pair of pliers. While I still had the heat gun handy downstairs, I also used it to remove the inlay strips from these hoops. I'm not a big fan of metal bass drum hoops, but since I also don't feel like investing extra resources into this project, these will have to do. For the next few steps, I need to move my operation upstairs, and this started with cutting down the bass drum shell from an 18-inch depth to 10 inches. The original Rhythm Traveler kits were an 8-inch depth, but when I did a rough layout with lugs and hardware, 10-inch made much more sense for this specific shell. I was really hoping to avoid moving the tom mount on this kick, but again, with the way I cut from the batter side, it just wasn't going to be a great spot for mounting these drums, so I decided to plug the holes that were currently there so that I could sand them back smooth and move it forward a few more inches. I chose to use dowels for this, but if I had the right size hole saw, it would have been great to cut some plugs from the 8-inch portion of this shell that I just cut off. It took some sanding and filing to get a nice tight fit, but after I did, I glued them in place and then used a flush cut saw to get the plugs close to flush with the shell. While I waited for the glue to dry on the bass drum, I went over the 3 tom shells with a sander to smooth out some nasty seams and residue left on the shell. Since I'd be painting these, I wasn't too worried with appearance, but it just didn't feel very smooth to the touch, so I wanted to clean them up a bit before painting. With these drums being single-headed concert toms, I thought it would make sense to add a finish to the inside of the shells, and I had some aluminum fence paint left over from a project I did previously trying to recreate Gretsch's famous silver sealer finish. I also considered black for the inside, but since the screw heads would also be silver, I thought this color would really help them disappear visually. While I waited for the toms to dry, I moved back over to the bass drum and sanded it flush where I'd added plugs. I moved my operation back downstairs because working in my uninsulated garage in winter is no fun, and I figured it would be easier to drill new holes for the lugs and tom mount before getting into painting this bass drum. I was able to just transfer markings from the original lug holes, which made this go pretty quickly, and then I moved on to drilling all the holes for the lugs, making sure to check for fit as I went along. I generally trust my measurements, but the process for correcting your measurements after drilling holes isn't a fun one. Moving on to the tom mount, it was a lot trickier because I had no gasket from the bracket to use as a template. I was able to transfer some placement lines from where I had plugged holes, but I had to spend a lot of time measuring from different angles to make sure I was drilling holes in the right spot. After I had all the holes drilled, I came back upstairs to spray the inside of this kick, and yes, I know I forgot to wear my mask, but I did have the garage door open at least, and I must have forgotten since I was on a phone call with a friend. I'm trying to make sure I'm a good example for people out there in terms of safety, so please ignore this clip on how to be safe while using spray paint. Later in the evening, after teaching my lessons for the day, I came back to all the hardware I had been soaking and removed it from the WD-40 and gave it a good wipe down. While drying off these pieces, I used a toothbrush and aluminum foil to get rid of any present rust or debris, and after I had it all done, I took it over to my sink in some smaller batches to rinse with water and get rid of any remaining WD-40 still on these parts. All these parts cleaned up fairly nicely, but I really try to avoid doing this step whenever possible since it's a total pain to go through all of these little bits one by one. Next up was the hoops for the toms, and for this, I used aluminum foil to clean them up, and it always impresses me how much better they look with just a little elbow grease. This is a step I try to do all the time because it really does make a difference for just a little bit of effort. I moved on to the bass drum hoops, and the residue left on here was across the entire inlay and was really stubborn. I tried a plastic razor blade and then my heat gun, but still it was making almost no impact. I decided maybe the best solution here would just be to mask off everything but the inlay with tape and come back and spray paint them to cover up the residue. I wouldn't call this a very thorough approach, but time is money, and I didn't really feel like investing hours and hours into cleaning up these metal bass drum hoops. While I was still downstairs, I grabbed the drum shells, brought them over to mask up with tape so that when I sprayed the exterior, I wouldn't get any overspray on this beautiful silver sealer interior finish. If you're a pro at doing finishes, I'm sure you can avoid overspray without this much masking, but I'm really not a pro at painting, and I'm also using pretty cheap spray paint cans, so this time spent masking off these drums should be well worth it in the end. I brought these shells back upstairs to begin spray painting, and after getting into the first coat, I quickly saw this was going to take multiple passes. I'm not denying that I'm an impatient person, so my natural instinct here is just to spray it on heavier and try to get it all done in one coat, but I know that's not realistic, so hopefully after a second coat in a few hours, I'll get a better result. After finishing up all the shells, I moved on to the hoops and sprayed them with the last bits of this aluminum fence paint that I had, and unfortunately, I started to run out by the end of the second hoop. I really didn't want to buy any more of this, since part of the decision to use it initially was because it'd been sitting on my shelf for years, but I decided I'd wait and see how things looked in the morning before making a decision to buy any more of this spray paint. Before calling it a night, I was able to go back up and get a second coat of paint on these toms and kick, getting much more consistent coverage. In my experience, even with a higher end spray paint where it's primer and paint in one, you never get it done with just one coat. The next morning, I brought these drums back downstairs after they had all night to cure. I was really pleased as I pulled away the tape, seeing no spill inside the drums, and overall, I think the finish turned out pretty good. As it came time to reattach all the hardware, I decided to work in an assembly line style fashion, starting with all 3 tom mounts, and then moving on to hand threading lugs and screws back in place, before coming in with a drill to tighten everything securely for good. I'm not sure if it really saved that much time, but it does make it easier on me not having to swap tools or task nearly as much. I wanted to add a nice set of matching clear heads to these toms, and as I went through my stock in the back room, I found a set of Evans EC2s in the right sizes. These weren't in bad shape, but really not my preferred setup, so I'm glad I could finally find a use for these. I made sure to use some white lithium grease as I threaded the tension rods into the lugs, just to make sure there wouldn't be any unnecessary friction as I tuned them up. As I finished tuning up the last of the toms, I decided to try and clean up the heads a bit, so I came back with a magic eraser to attempt to clean some of the stick marks, and it actually worked fairly well. Moving on to the bass drum, I started again by removing the masking tape, and I was pretty nervous to see how these hoops would turn out. I really didn't have a ton of faith in these looking any good, but as I went through and pulled off the tape, I was really surprised with how passable they were. It's definitely the kind of thing where close up it looks pretty inconsistent from the leftover adhesive, but from a distance and mounted to a drum, it's pretty passable. So just like the toms, I got all the hardware attached to the shell, and as I made my way through, adding back the tom brackets, lugs, and spurs, I realized I totally forgot to cut a new bearing edge on this fresh batter side. I usually do this step before drilling holes, but this project has been a much different order of operations for me, so it must have just slipped my mind to do it any point along the way. I continued to get all the hardware attached, minus the spur legs, but then added some tape to the fresh cut edge and took this drum upstairs to add some new bearing edges. I did a small chamfer on the outside, and then did a deeper cut on the inside, which I did over 2 to 3 passes so that I wouldn't get a rough cut from taking off too much at once. Once I had a bearing edge I was satisfied with, I could come back downstairs, remove the tape, add the spur legs to the mount, and then get this drum re-headed and tuned up. I had an extra super kick head around for the batter side, and as much as I would have liked to had a clear resonant side to show off the silver sealer interior, I settled on this black head to match the exterior because it's what I had available in my stock. So after just about a day's work, this project was complete, and I could bring these drums into the studio to set them up and hear how they sound. Okay, so after getting to play these a little bit, my initial impression is that they're very one-dimensional. Concert toms do a thing, and they do it really well, but that's the only thing they do in my opinion. The tone overall has this kind of bark or growl to it, especially in the floor tom. Some of that is probably my tuning and lack of skill with this sort of setup, but I messed around with it for a while before I hit record on the cameras, and in any sort of tuning, it does that thing. The bass drum sounds great. I put one towel in there, and I think that really helped kind of tighten up the tone a little bit more. But I want to try one more thing with these drums before making my final conclusion on them, and that's throw some muffling rings on the toms to try and just hamper down on the tone a little bit, and I'll do the same for the snare. Overall, I think these drums turned out really good. I only have $30 invested into the bass drum, $0 into the toms and heads and all the other parts, and just about a day's work, so I would call this project a success. I really like the look of them. I think the black on the outside and the silver on the inside looks really sharp, and I love it on the bass drum hoops. I could have done a better job with the painting and execution on the hoops, but as far as a proof of concept, I really like this approach. When I first got this drum set, before I ever gave it to Taylor at Stone Arch, my thought was to use it in my teaching studio and have mesh heads on the top and set it up in a corner since it doesn't have a lot of depth or take up a lot of space. And what I quickly learned when I put on the Remo Silent Strokes was that having no resonant head meant these drums had like 0 tone. So it just wasn't really a good setup for that. And honestly, I can't see myself needing this over any of the other drum sets I have and use regularly. And I already found a buyer to take this one on. It's gonna go to one of my friends who plays drums. One of his kids wants to start playing and he wants to have a set at home for them to play. Just something small and compact. This will be a nice setup because since the toms are so shallow, you can actually position everything pretty low. So I think that'll work great for them. And on top of that, it's always fun to make these videos and share them with you. So I'd love to hear what you think about this. Leave a comment down below. Let me know. And until next time, thanks.